Welcome to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast, where we hear from some of the most relevant, up-to-date, informational speakers in our industry. In episode 44, Kim Ominski, professor at the University of Manitoba, shares her story. Seeking Sustainability Through Innovation, a look at the cattle industry.
You ready? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Glenn, for the very kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. So I'm going to try to set the stage for the rest of the speakers who are going to be speaking this afternoon, and the topic that we've been given is Seeking Sustainability Through Innovation, and I'll look at the cattle industry. So everyone's aware that the challenge that we face globally is the increase in population, and that we're expected to reach 9 billion people by 2050, and that 2.4 billion people will be classified as middle-class consumers by 2030. And that means that there's going to be a significant increase in demand for protein-based foods, including milk and meat. And as an export beef nation, that allows us some opportunities. However, along with opportunity comes challenge. And not only the growing population, but there's many other challenges facing the cattle industry. Issues related to, for example, transportation policy, lots of discussion about climate change and the role of beef cattle production in climate change, weather, certainly changing weather and trying to manage through that changing weather, trade, local trade agreements, regional trade agreements, international trade agreements. And so we certainly have the road mapped in front of us in terms of those policy type issues. I think another significant challenge to us is consumer preferences, consumer perceptions, and attitudes of those consumers, not only to all agriculture, but certainly to animal agriculture. And none of these images are probably unfamiliar to many of you. Things like Food Inc., Cowspiracy, and just the impact of cattle in terms of the environment. And so, in amongst these challenges, we have to think about our path for a sustainable future. And there's many criteria to think about when we consider sustainability. Of course, economic sustainability and social sustainability are an important part of the whole notion of sustainability, but environmental as well. And Trevor's going to talk this afternoon about, how do we fit environmental sustainability into our production systems. So things like climate change, soil quality, biodiversity and natural habitat, nutrient and water use efficiency, and water quality. And Terence in his talk is going to focus some of his discussion on the issues of soil quality. So the challenges are many, and that means as an industry we need to work together to develop effective strategies of management. Before I go any further, I'd like to pause just for a minute and remind all of us the value of cattle production systems. Certainly there's lots of information and lots of research to show that it has a positive role in terms of reduced soil erosion, improved soil quality, increased biodiversity, increased carbon sequestration, more natural habitat, the opportunity to turn an inedible fiber into a high value or highly valued protein product, and then of course economic development for rural communities. So I think it's fair to say that cattle producers and consumers really share a common ground. And that shared common ground is an appreciation for natural resource management. And that's what we do as cattle producers. I think it's clear that we've used technology very effectively over the course of time to lead to vast improvements in production efficiency, but at the same time, improvements in sustainability. Things like growth-promoting technologies, genetics, feed additives, improvements in forage quality, and improvements in grazing management. This is an example of how these innovations that have been used at the farmscape level have led to improvements in sustainability. These are hard numbers that we can use when we're talking to the general public about the changes and the improvements that we've made in the industry. This is a study where we looked at the carbon footprint of cattle, so greenhouse gas emissions, which come from the digestion of feed within the rumen. Those microorganisms in the rumen have the capacity, as I said, to take this low-quality inedible fiber and convert it to milk and meat production. And as a consequence of that fermentation or that digestion of feed, we have methane produced. And so our research has shown that between the years of 1981 and 2011, so in that 30-year time frame, we've actually reduced our greenhouse gas production by about 15%. We recently just completed a study looking at water use efficiency in the industry. And so certainly if we look at absolute amounts of water use, that has increased because the industry as a whole has increased. But if we compare the years, again, those target years of 1981 and 2011, on a kilogram of beef produced basis, we've actually decreased our water use by 17%. How have those innovations, or how have those successes come about? And they've come about through innovation. They've come about through improvements in reproductive efficiency, increased weaning weights, and then increased end carcass weights of both steers and heifers. On the crop side, we've seen increased in feed crop yields, barley silage, which make up the majority of, and corn silage, which make up the majority of our feedlot diets. So what will the future hold for us, and how will we continue to take advantage of innovation to achieve sustainability in all of its many forms? The first is biological efficiency. So these are, some of them are on-farm, but some of them are beyond on-farm. So perennial grains, for example, and I'm going to talk about perennial grains and some of the major corporations like General Mills that are interested in investing in perennial grains, which have a role for cattle. Land sharing or land swapping, and both Joey and Trevor are going to talk about that in their conversations. And then improved nutrient cycling through grazing management, and Terence is going to touch on that. We've heard this term used called the Internet of Things, and that really just means how can we remotely use things like sensors to control some of the equipment and the technologies that we use. And certainly we have precision feeding systems in cattle where we can supplement cattle, maybe in extended grazing systems. Individually, we can individually supplement animals and monitor how much they're actually eating remotely with data acquisition. The other technology that I think we can't overlook is this whole notion of fake, or what's called clean meat. And the reality that companies like Cargill, I think it was the end of August, invested in a company called Memphis Meats that's looking at this notion of tissue-based, or the growth of tissue-based animal proteins as a source of meat protein. And then, of course, thinking about things like policy development. Joey's going to talk about ELLIS-based programs, and certainly things like water use policies are paramount to the industry. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about this perennial grain. It's an intermediate wheatgrass called Kernza. And again, this is where large corporations like General Mills are investing their money. This perennial grain has the potential to be harvested in the fall, fertilized, and then regrown for some fall grazing. This is a crop from one of our field sites. Doug Catani is a breeder in the Department of Plant Science. And this is one of his crops where that was harvested, as I said, in August, fertilized, and then this is the biomass that was available come early October. And this was in 2016. In terms of, we talked about this notion of fake meats. So on the left, the little bits in a dish are plant-based meat products, and on the right is this notion of tissue beef. And as I said, companies like Cargill that have traditionally been invested in traditional protein sources are certainly investing in these alternative protein sources so that they have a view of serving all of their customers and their customer needs. What about beyond farm innovations? And I think that Canada has really led in this direction. So the notion from the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, the CCIA tags or the RFID tags that have allowed us to trace cattle from their herd of origin. And certainly with the outbreak of BSE, those CCIA tags really saved the backside of Canada because this industry innovation, again, it wasn't a government-led initiative, it was an industry-led initiative that allowed us to give confidence to other countries that we could trace forward and trace back those animals from the original herd of origin. And that allowed us to reestablish our trading partners more quickly. We have lots of examples of information management. You know, the BIXIS program, for example, is a strategy of how we can take what is otherwise a segmented industry in terms of cow-calf production, backgrounding, and finishing, and provide the opportunity to get information back to cow-calf producers in terms of making good breeding decisions. The Verified Beef Production Program, again, is another industry leader, which is now expanded to include other elements, such as animal welfare, for example. And I think that the industry, including the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, has done an outstanding job of training training young leaders. The Cattlemen Young Leaders Program offers opportunities for young people to have mentors. Those mentors can be across the country. We've had several here from Manitoba. Christine, formerly Blair, now Christine Tapley, is an example where her mentor was Jeff Fitzpatrick-Stillwell from McDonald's Canada. As a consequence of that, she had opportunities to serve on the Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and then had the opportunity to work with Sobeys, and in fact is in some of their advertising for what a young beef producers look like to the consumer. And it's all of these innovations that led McDonald's and the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, or as a partner in the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, to choose Canada to launch its pilot program for verified sustainable beef. And of course, the Roundtable continues to grow in its membership and includes all aspects of the cattle and retailing industry. And then I think we need to only look right in our own backyards at MBFI. MBFI is an excellent example for information exchange. It involves several organizations, Ducks Unlimited, Manitoba Agriculture, Manitoba Forage and Grassland Association, and the Manitoba Beef Producers, and allows an opportunity to take research and put it to the ground and have producers be involved as a part of that research. And Ramona's going to talk about that in more detail. So in conclusion then, I think when we think about the cattle industry and sustainability, I think we have to say that sustainability is really more than conserving what was. It's more than just surviving change. It's the discovery of new opportunities, and I think the cattle industry in Canada has led in that direction. We have to continue to anticipate the many changes that we'll be faced with. We have to enhance the resilience or the adaptive capacity of our system. And I'm going to go back again to talk about the importance to what I mentioned earlier about the development of science-based policy. And I think that many corporations or companies and retailers are trying to meet consumer demands in terms of the products that we produce. But I think we can't leave behind the notion of the development of science-based policy and science-based information to help inform consumers and to find the shared common ground between us. So what are some last thoughts? I think the future of our industry includes lots of change. Climate change, technology, social change, and other things that we can't even or haven't even thought of. But we've demonstrated our capacity for adaptation already, and I think we will continue to do so in the future. I think we can agree that education, innovation, and sound policy are key to successful adaptation for the future. And I think most importantly, we'll agree that the benefits and challenges for sustainable cattle production are substantial. However, we need to work together to develop locally relevant solutions to the challenges that we face with. That means researchers working hand in hand with producers and other collaborations on things like research, applied investigation, tech transfer, extension, and policy and programming development with both our provincial and our federal governments. And so with that, I'd like to entertain any questions that anybody might have, and if not, then I look forward to turning it over to the other speakers this afternoon. So I'm going to let Terence, that's going to be what he's going to talk about this afternoon. And there's actually, across Canada, but even here in Manitoba, there's a lot of soil carbon sequestration work. And so maybe without stealing Terence's thunder, I'll let him address that question. Any other comments or questions? It's really hard to see you out there. Go ahead. Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of work going on in cover crops. Martin Entz at the University of Manitoba does some work. Yvonne Lawley is doing work in cover crops. The interesting thing about cover crops, I would say, is that in many ways producers are leading that science. Producers are trying different cover crops and different cover crop combinations. And what we need to do, I think, with cover crops is ensure that we're looking at, in order to make good recommendations, I think we need to look at differences in terms of those combinations of crops, but also at different locations. Because the value of being able to, even in any forage species, of being able to test it, is to be able to look at it across sites and say, in some regions this worked really well, but in other regions that worked really well. Any other comments or questions? No? Okay, I'd like to thank again thank Glenn very much for the opportunity to be here, and I'll be around all afternoon, and I'd love the opportunity to chat with anybody who's interested in doing so.
Thank you very much, Kim.
Thanks for tuning in to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast. We'll see you next year from January 22nd to 24th, 2019.